It's 1962. The Cold War is at its peak. Top U.S. generals sit in the Pentagon and sign a document so explosive it's still shocking today. Their proposal: bomb American cities, sink U.S. ships, hijack passenger planes, and murder American citizens, all so they could blame Fidel Castro and justify invading Cuba. This wasn't a rogue plan. It came from the highest levels of the U.S. military. It had an official name, and it was signed, dated, and sent to the Secretary of Defense. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is declassified history. You're listening to Archive Vault Podcast, where we open the sealed files, read the redacted memos, and expose the government's secrets they never wanted you to hear. I'm your host, Joshua. Tonight, we uncover Operation Northwoods. Everything you're about to hear is based on declassified government documents and historical records. No speculation, just the files. Now, let's go back to the early 1960s, when the United States was willing to consider doing the unthinkable to win the Cold War. By 1962, Cuba had become America's biggest national security headache, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. It began in 1959 when Fidel Castro overthrew the brutal dictator Fulgencio Batista. At first, many in the U.S. welcomed the change, but that hope quickly vanished. Castro declared himself a communist, seized American-owned businesses, executed political opponents, and formed a close alliance with the Soviet Union. For Washington, this was unacceptable. A Soviet-backed communist outpost right in America's backyard. In April 1961, President John F. Kennedy approved the Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA-planned operation carried out by Cuban exiles. The goal was to overthrow Castro in a swift strike. Instead, it turned into a complete disaster. The invaders were defeated within days. In a rare move for the era, President Kennedy publicly took full responsibility. Just days after the failure, he told the press, "There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. I am the responsible officer of the government." Humiliated but more determined than ever, the Kennedy administration launched a new, even more aggressive secret program called Operation Mongoose, now fully declassified. Mongoose was a wide-ranging covert war against Castro that included sabotage of Cuban infrastructure, propaganda campaigns, economic warfare, and multiple assassination attempts on Castro himself, some involving poisoned cigars and exploding seashells. But by early 1962, the Pentagon was growing impatient. The secret operations weren't producing fast enough results. The military wanted a full-scale invasion with American troops. They wanted regime change. There was only one major obstacle. They needed a strong justification, something that would rally the American public and the international community behind an open war with Cuba. They couldn't simply attack without a clear pretext. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff began developing ideas for manufactured provocations, pretexts. What they eventually proposed in a top-secret memorandum would shock even seasoned Cold War warriors. That memorandum, signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer, carried the title, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It would later become infamous as Operation Northwoods, and its contents were chilling. On March 13, 1962, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer, reviewed and signed a top-secret document. Its official title was bland and bureaucratic, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. But what was written inside was anything but ordinary. This single memorandum outlined a series of staged provocations, false flag operations, designed to create the appearance that Cuba had attacked the United States or its allies. The goal was clear: manufacture a justifiable reason for America to launch a full-scale military invasion and remove Fidel Castro once and for all. The plan carried the code name Operation Northwoods. The proposals were shockingly detailed. Here are some of the key ideas taken directly from the declassified memo. Attacks on Guantanamo Bay. Stage Cuban attacks on the U.S. naval base. This included blowing up ammunition depots, burning aircraft on the runway, staging riots using friendly Cubans disguised as Castro's soldiers, and even capturing supposed saboteurs. The memo suggested creating lists of fake casualties and holding dramatic funerals to generate public outrage. The Remember the Main option, sink a U.S. ship, either real or a drone vessel, in Guantanamo Bay or near Havana and blame Cuban forces. The document literally recommended preparing casualty lists in advance so newspapers could run emotional headlines. A terror campaign inside the United States launched a communist Cuban terror campaign in major Florida cities and even Washington, D.C. This included bombing civilian targets, sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees, wounding or assassinating Cuban exiles, and planting evidence that pointed straight to Castro's regime. The airliner plot. One of the most disturbing proposals involved hijacking or destroying a civilian passenger plane. The plan is suggested using a drone aircraft made to look like a real commercial flight. A genuine plane with passengers would fly nearby, then be told it was part of a substitute flight for national security reasons. The drone would be remotely destroyed over Cuba, and the incident blamed on Castro's Air Force. Other provocations. Fake Cuban attacks on other Caribbean countries, U.S. pilots flying disguised MiG jets to harass civilian aircraft, staged defections of Cuban soldiers, and planting Soviet bloc weapons at the scenes of attacks to tie everything back to communism. The memo was written in cold, clinical language. It spoke of pretexts, waves of national indignation, in a period of heightened U.S.-Cuban tensions, as if discussing routine military logistics. At its core, the plan aimed to place the United States in the position of suffering defensible grievances from an irresponsible government of Cuba, giving America the moral and political cover it needed to invade. These weren't vague ideas scribbled on a napkin. This was a formal 15-page memorandum endorsed by the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff and sent directly to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. It represented the mindset inside the Pentagon in 1962, the belief that the threat of communism justified almost any action, even if that meant deceiving the American people and the world. The memorandum reached Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on March 13, 1962. Just 3 days later, on March 16th, it landed on President John F. Kennedy's desk. What happened next would quietly determine whether the United States would cross a dangerous line. According to notes from the meeting and later accounts, President Kennedy was direct and firm. He made it clear he was not interested in manufacturing pretexts for war. He shut down any immediate discussion of invasion. The more aggressive elements of Operation Northwoods were rejected outright. Kennedy had already been burned by the Bay of Pigs. He was wary of the Pentagon's eagerness for another confrontation so soon. He understood that staging attacks on Americans, even if they were fake, carried enormous moral, legal, and political risks. One leak, one mistake, and the blowback could destroy his presidency and America's global standing. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who had signed the document, did not remain in his position for long. In October 1962, just months after Northwoods was proposed, he was quietly reassigned as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe. It was a prestigious post, but a clear sidelining from direct influence over Cuba policy. The Joint Chiefs got the message. The most radical false flag proposals were shelved. Later that same year, in October 1962, the world came to the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet missiles were discovered on Cuban soil, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 terrifying days, the United States and the Soviet Union stared each other down. In that high-stakes moment, Kennedy's earlier caution about rushing into war with Cuba may have helped prevent catastrophe. The crisis was resolved through back-channel diplomacy and a naval quarantine rather than full invasion. Operation Northwoods never left the planning stage. No American cities were bombed. No passenger planes were sacrificed. No ships were deliberately sunk for propaganda. But the mere fact that such a plan had been formally written, signed, and seriously considered by America's top military leaders revealed how far some were willing to go in the name of national security. For more than 30 years, Operation Northwoods remained buried in classified files. Almost no one outside the highest levels of government knew it had ever existed. Then in the late 1990s, the Assassination Records Review Board, created to release documents related to the Kennedy assassination, declassified the memo. In 2001, author James Bamford brought it to public attention in his best-selling book, Body of Secrets. The world finally learned what the Pentagon had been willing to consider in 1962. The reaction was immediate and intense. Here was concrete proof, on official Joint Chiefs of Staff letterhead, that America's highest-ranking military officers had proposed killing American citizens. Defenders of the plan argue that it was simply contingency planning during an extremely dangerous time. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons pointed at America. Cuba was actively exporting revolution across Latin America. The generals believed they were facing an existential threat and were exploring every possible option. Critics, however, see something darker: a willingness by powerful institutions to deceive the public and sacrifice innocent lives for geopolitical goals. The document has since become a key reference point in discussions about government overreach, false flag operations, limits of trust between citizens and their leaders. Even today, Operation Northwoods is frequently cited in debates about intelligence agencies, pretexts for war, and the importance of civilian oversight of the military. Importantly, the historical record is clear on one point. The plan was proposed, but it was rejected by civilian leadership. President Kennedy said no. That decision mattered. Operation Northwoods never happened. No Americans died because of it. No bombs exploded in Miami. No airliners were sacrificed. But the fact that it was written down, signed, and sent up the chain of command should serve as a permanent warning. It shows how fear and pressure can push even honorable people to consider dangerous ideas. It reminds us that power, even in a democracy, must always be watched carefully. In the end, the story of Operation Northwoods is not just about one rejected memo from 1962. It's about the constant tension between security and morality, between ends and means. John F. Kennedy's decision to reject the plan may have helped steer the United States away from a wider war in the Caribbean, one that could easily have escalated into something far worse. Today, with new technologies making deception easier than ever, the lessons from this declassified file remain as relevant as they were 60 years ago. Who watches the watchers? Where does national security end and moral integrity begin? Those questions didn't end in 1962. They're still with us. Thanks for listening to that episode of Archive Vault Podcast. The full declassified Northwoods Memorandum is available online through the National Security Archive. I highly recommend reading it yourself. If you want more deep dives into declassified history, hit that subscribe button and leave a review. It really helps the show. I'm your host, Joshua. Until next time, keep digging. The files are waiting. We'll be back soon with more stories from the archives. See you next time.